Okay. Good afternoon. This is Ed Stafford, a retired Foreign Service officer, and this is the third episode of Anatolian Dispatch. We cover everything about Turkey, but really everything about Turkey that interfaces with the United States. And today, my guest is Ilhan Tanir of Ahval News, and we are one of the podcasts of Ahval News. And I would recommend to all of those who are listening that if you don't follow Ahval News, you're not informed as you should be about what's going on in Turkey. So let's just get started. And I know that Ilhan has a couple of questions concerning what's going on over the last week between the United States and Turkey. We're having a little technical problem here. I cannot hear Ilhan right now.
Okay, sorry about that. All right.
No worries.
All right. So today, we were planning about this podcast. That there was a letter published. We are going to also talk about it. I'd like to ask a couple of questions, but just to inform the viewers, this letter came from the Congress, from both sides of the Congress. We published this letter earlier in the day, Ahval English. You can still go and see it as a top item. It's about 2017 Washington, D.C. Brawl, in which, as I understand, you were still in the government and you were serving. So I am going to ask about that as well. I am curious about from inside account. But let me very briefly summarize. In 2017, President Erdogan came, obviously. President Trump was in the White House. They had the meeting. The hot issue was Syrian Kurds, and Erdogan came here in the town to cut the ties between the U.S. and the Syrian Kurds, which the Turkey accuses as the part of the PKK, a designated terrorist organization by U.S. and Europe and Turkey. That didn't go very well, but after that meeting, Mr. Erdogan went to the Sheridan circle where the Turkish ambassador residence there, and then as soon as Mr. Erdogan arrived to the residence, we have seen that lots of videos came out later on, but the very precise one came from Voice of America, showing that as soon as Erdogan came, his bodyguards attacked the protesters. Obviously, the Turkish side is saying that it was not an attack, it was protesters who actually started the fight. So this went to the court. It has been going for several years, and today, just this afternoon, so far this has not been reported, by the way. Department of Justice came with its brief. Let me give you to background in this judicial process, and I'll let you talk about the Department of Justice brief and what does it mean. There are two different civil suits against the Turkish government. Protesters, I think it's over a dozen protesters, launch civil suits against Turkish government, saying that Turkish security agents attacked them with no reason, basically, and that the court, the district court, ruled against Turkey, but Turkish government take it to the appellate court, appealed the ruling. It is now at the three judge panel is looking at the decision, but this three-judge panel asked Department of Justice to weigh in this and say whether Turkish agents are right to do whatever they did. And that decision came today, and you have that brief. Tell us what the Department of Justice is saying.
Well, let me just clarify a couple things about Sheridan Square. I was in my final assignment teaching at the Inter-American Defense College. However, a very close friend of mine who is a professor at Georgetown University and used to work for the National Security Council was literally on a bus passing Sheridan Square and saw the brawl. And he and I talked about it extensively. Brawl is a euphemism for really what happened. It was an attack by President Erdogan's security personnel, protective detail, we would call it, on the protesters. To get to the protesters, they broke through the protective line that was being maintained by uniformed members of the what's called the Federal Protective Service and personnel of the Metropolitan Police. They had their backs to the security personnel because they were confronting and holding in place the protesters. There's also an audio recording of President Erdogan. Allegedly, it's a little garbled. It's difficult. He's of course speaking in Turkish, but it appears to be that he told the security personnel to go sort them out, or words to that effect. So that fact is rather important because it shows that the fact of the matter is that these people were attacked while they were legitimately protesting. Now, some of the people attacked were American citizens. Some of them were the police people who were pushed in the back and shoved out of the way. And there's some allegations that the Turkish protective detail, that one of the members of the Turkish protective detail drew his firearm. So it got really quite hairy. But the plaintiffs who are suing are U.S. citizens. There were also some American persons, that is to say they are what's called legal permanent residents, who enjoy basically all the rights and privileges of a U.S. citizen except the ability to vote. And there's really not much more that separates a U.S. citizen from a legal permanent resident in the terms of what legal recourses they have. So where are we now? Well, where we are is that there was the court solicited from the Department of Justice a opinion, and that was actually provided by the acting legal counsel of the Department of State. And in that friend of the court brief, he basically lays out, how in fact this could go to the court. It's a rather balanced brief. What it fundamentally says is that though foreign dignitaries coming to the United States do have the right of using their own protective detail to protect them from harm, it's not a carte blanche, and it's not, it doesn't cover all situations. In other words, if there was no protective action taking place, then the members of the protective detail can be held either criminally or civilly liable. And in this case, it's a civil lawsuit for damages and violations of their rights and so forth and so on. From the facts of the case of what took place at Sheridan Square, it's hard to see that the protective detail for President Erdogan was in fact doing anything to protect him. The protesters were across the street, and they were in no way attempting to break through the police line that was keeping them across the street. So they were being held on the sidewalk. The police line, the Metropolitan Police and others were holding them in place. And again, the Turkish protective detail, President Erdogan's protective detail, had to actually break through the back of the police line to get to the protesters. So clearly the protesters were in no way threatening the president. So the brief goes into some, legal details about, is it possible for a protective detail to kind of a visiting dignitary to have immunity? And the answer is yes, but only if they're performing their protective functions. And so what the court is going to have to decide is whether, based on the facts of the matter, they accept that the Turkish protective detail was actually protecting President Erdogan at that point, and therefore their actions, they could not be held accountable for their actions because they were just doing their function.
Let me recap here for those who just came on. You are now about to tell us that what is the Department of Justice brief or decision, or how it looks at the 2017 brawl in which the Turkish President Erdogan's bodyguards attacked about a dozen protesters. Department of Justice was asked by the court to let their opinion know about this, whether Turkish bodyguards have right to attack the protesters due to the immunity to protect the Turkish president, or it was unlawful, therefore the civil suits launched against Turkish president should continue.
Right. Well, the brief that I have was actually written by the acting legal advisor for the Department of State. That would make sense. The Department of Justice would pass it over to state because they're the ones intimately involved in this, and because it touches on some, fine legal issues about immunity of things. In sum, it's a balanced brief. In other words,
there is also acting Assistant Attorney General's signature on the first page, Brian Boynton.
Right. That's standard because it would have to come from the Department of Justice to the court. It is the Department of Justice that represents the United States government before the federal courts. So but as a friend of the court brief, the court can accept it really from anyone who the court agrees has an interest in the matter. My guess is that this was probably principally drafted by the State Department legal office because of the particular international relations legal questions involved. So DOJ would go to the Department of State and say, look, you have the expertise on this. Draft up an answer, let us know, and then we'll move forward with it. And they would then, of course, append their signature because that's what has to be done. But in sum, basically what it says is that there are circumstances in which the protective detail of a foreign dignitary visiting the United States would enjoy immunity from actions, whether they were violent or caused harm, okay? But it's constrained in that they must be engaging in actions that are actually part of their function to protect the foreign dignitary. So to take an extreme example of what would not be the case, imagine that these members of the protective detail had, after they had escorted the president to the ambassador's residence, they had gone out and gotten into an argument with some people and, got into a fight with them and physically harmed them. They would, of course, not enjoy any protection. So it's the court, the appeals court, that now house the case, is going to have to decide whether they believe the President Erdogan's protective detail was acting to protect him when they attacked the protesters. And I'm sure there are different opinions about whether they were protecting the president when they were attacking those protesters.
Yes. So the Department of Justice cites against Turkey in this brief. And let me read the quote. We are going to publish this 18-page brief.
Mm-hmm.
It says that on the basis of the district court's factual determinations, however, the United States agrees with its conclusion that Turkey is not immune from these suits. And it cites two reasons why Turkey is not immune. Usually, the Turkish details as protecting foreign leader should be immune. But in this case, it says, again, we are going to publish this 18-page brief shortly. Page 15, first of all, you mentioned, you touched that. It says, it cites the district court's previous ruling, in which the court says, at the time of the principal altercation between plaintiffs and the Turkish security personnel, plaintiffs, along with their other protesters, were standing and remaining on the Sheridan Circle sidewalk, which had been designated for protesting by United States law enforcement. And it says that yet the Turkish agents crossed the police line, as you touched this, separating them from the protesters in order to attack the protesters. And as a second reason, it says the actions of the Turkish agents took after the initial attack leave little doubt that they were using force for a purpose outside their proper protective function. It's that the protesters did not rush to meet the attack, and none of those actions could reasonably be regarded as protective in character, because the Department of Justice says, or the State Department Counsel says that because those protesters were not attacking and were standing in the designated area, right, in which is supposed to be protected.
Right. I mean, there's little dispute, and as I mentioned earlier, a very close friend of mine was literally, and this is a competent person. He was a retired university professor. He had served on the National Security Council staff, and he observed what was going on, and he affirms that, the protesters were not behaving in any sort of aggressive or threatening manner before they were attacked by the protective detail. So what we have is a brief that, agrees with the facts, but it also has an interpretation. And as you read, it's saying you really can't see their actions as being part of their protective function, which is the only way they have any sort of immunity, is if they're doing their protective function, which the brief agrees with. So if they were being protective, they have immunity. But the brief goes on to say, our interpretation is they were not being protective when they engaged in this attack. Now, does that mean that the court will agree with that interpretation. Who knows?
We will see.
But the court's not only going to be relying on this brief, but it's going to be relying on the finding of facts by the district court. And what the brief, as you noted, it quotes from the district court's finding of facts. And it is, quite frankly, I think it's impossible to imagine the appeals court disagreeing with the district court's finding of facts, which means you'd have to have some really wild interpretation that would prevent this case from going forward. I think it's worth noting that the acting legal counsel of the Department of State did not raise any sort of diplomatic relations issues in his brief. In other words, he's treating it very much as a legal issue. This is not something that has anything to do with diplomatic relations. In other words, nobody from the State Department seems to be trying to intervene to move this away from being a strictly legal affair to being some sort of diplomatic matter. That's, clearly that's not what the Turkish government would like, because they would like it to be moved out of the courts and put into kind of just negotiations between the United States and Turkey, where it would go into a deep, dark, black hole to never be heard of again.
Which we should remind that during the Trump administration, Secretary Tillerson tried really hard. And initially there were charges against 15 bodyguards, and then 11 of them were dropped right before Secretary Tillerson made a visit to Turkey in early 2018. But since then, this civil suit have been continuing, and now that the Biden administration came, this brief came pretty quickly, and I actually asked a law expert, what does, the question is the Turkey is going to pay money now? Obviously, we are going to wait what the court is going to decide now for the appeal, 3-judge panel. But what I am told is if the 3-judge panel rules against Turkey, in line with this brief coming from the State Department, that will mean that there will be a judgment entered against Ankara, and plaintiffs will then can seek Turkey attachable assets in the United States to recover the judgment. And so it's going to be interesting. We are going to follow the next step, obviously, but for now, we broke the news. This is the first time that State Department and Department of Justice brief on the 2017 Brawl. U.S. government sided against the Turkish government in this case.
Yeah,
so let's go to yes.
Yeah, I would just be really careful about saying. I would not say that the United States government is siding against Turkey in this case.
Okay.
What I would phrase it a little differently. I would say that the U.S. government is simply letting the independent judicial system make progress. It will give an objective opinion on the facts of the matter, but it's not going to try to pull this out, as Tillerson obviously did, out of the legal arena and put it into diplomatic relations. That's, I think, a very strong message to Turkey about the United States current administration's commitment to the rule of law and maintaining the rule of law, even when it is in a relationship with an important partner. There you go.
Okay, so let's move to number 2 and number 3, since we already spent most of time on this breaking news. This week's second top item seemed like the Afghan peace talks. A letter which was not denied by the U.S. State Department yesterday. It seems like the U.S., according to the letter published in the Afghani press, Secretary Blinken wants Afghan peace talks, to be held in Ankara.
Right.
What does it mean? What is the significance of this invite, and whether this will be a way for U.S. and Turkish governments to do something together?
Well, if the Turkish government is wise, they will do everything they can to accommodate the holding of these peace talks and work collaboratively with the U.S. It was a bit surprising, though, because also during this week there was some point where the White House spokesperson Jen Psaki was asked, when will President Biden get around to calling President Erdogan? And she implied, well, it could be weeks, it could be months. It's kind of odd to be asking the Turkish government to provide their good offices to help with these negotiations involving the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan when you still haven't done the courtesy phone call from the President of the United States to the President of Turkey. So that's a little odd. At the same time, it's important to understand, as mentioned in that letter, that these conversations would not be simply the United States, Afghanistan, and the Taliban, but you can see the list. China's included, Russia's included, Pakistan, I think, was also included. The interesting line was the line where Secretary Blinken states that, all of these countries are interested in the stability of Afghanistan. Well, I'm not so sure that all of those countries are interested in greater stability in Afghanistan. One or two of them might be very happy to see Afghanistan remain a mess. Not that the Taliban become ascendant, but that the Taliban continue to be a thorn in the side of the Afghan government. So, but it's kind of a strange thing. We'll see if it comes to pass. Clearly, the letter was leaked by somebody in the Afghan government to try to generate some sympathy for the Afghan government that is feeling itself being pressed by the former Trump administration and by the President Biden administration to negotiate with the Taliban when they don't think that's a wise thing, that the withdrawal of American forces will leave them in a very precarious position, and that the Taliban are growing in strength and biding their time until the Americans leave. And so we'll see. I mean, I would be surprised if the Turkish government resisted hosting such talks. It would give them a great deal of diplomatic prestige. They would obviously get a place at the table alongside the United States, Russia, China, Pakistan, and of course the Afghans and the Taliban. So
the question you mentioned about the Jen Psaki at the White House, I think it was Friday, I believe. I might be wrong. Maybe Monday. I don't know.
Yeah, 2 days ago.
So it was pretty interesting that, it was about Ekim Alptekin, this famous former Turkish American business council leader. And he basically gave this interview, and in which the reason of the interview was obvious, to show that he actually hosted Joe Biden's brother, Jim Biden.
Yes, well,
why? Let me ask this question. So the question was asked by Newsmax, which is a conservative Trumpist channel. It seemed to me pretty obvious that we know pro-Erdogan operatives, tie between pro-Erdogan operatives and some of the Trump figures. So this was, to me, I don't know the insider info. To me, it was obvious that this interview sent to Newsmax in one way or another through this last 4 years relationship ties. And this was asked to Jan Psaki about his brother. Why would Ekim Alptekin, who is still a fugitive, still a court case against him, indictment against him, whether he's guilty or not, he's not still found guilty, by the way. His judicial process continues, but obviously he was in good relationship with the Trump era, and he's known as pro-Trump, and he was very pro-Trump, which is nothing is wrong with that. Anyone can be pro-Trump, obviously. But now that he comes back and he talks about this, his relationship with Biden's brother, I was surprised to see it. What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, I think that sometimes Mr. Alptekin misreads the influence that some people believe that they have and have tried to show, and he tries to take advantage of that. The famous one, of course, is the case for which he's facing trial, and that was trying to use the services of Michael Flynn to influence the United States to extradite Fethullah Gulen. So he does this. He misreads how the American system works. It is not to his advantage to create the impression that he is a good friend of Jim Biden, and therefore what? President Biden is going to have the charges against him dropped? That's not how things work. And in fact, even if at this point there were people in the White House who wanted to persuade President Biden to lean on the Department of Justice to drop charges against Alptekin, flaunting his having entertained Jim Biden in Turkey on a visit isn't going to help that case. In fact, it's just going to make, because, it starts with Newsmax, but now it's out there. And at this point in time, can you imagine the screaming to be heard if suddenly Alptekin's case were dropped due to pressure from the Biden White House? It just really was. As we say, I have no idea what he was thinking.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not going to, make it any longer of this, but it really seems to me there are a number of people between the U.S.-Turkey relations that became very prominent during the Trump era. And it looks like they're still trying to cling their seats, that they're still trying to stay in this area, even though, Erdogan's son-in-law is gone, who is very close to Jared Kushner and the Trump. And now this week, Istanbul Stock Market's general manager, Hakan Atilla, who was convicted at the U.S. court. He is gone. There are a number of changes Erdogan is making. Obviously, some of the figures are still trying to stay relevant. One of those is Turkish-American Business Council leader. The current one is Mehmet Ali Yalçındağ, and the former one is the Ekim Aptekin. But my question is, these people are doing their PRs. I see this as a PR.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely, Ekim Aptekin put his name again to the press. But I am asking this question, whether any Turkish businessmen are benefiting from this PR stance, whether Mehmet Ali Yalçındağ brings the lobbyists and then make them talk about Turkish US relations without giving the real picture, and trying to stay relevant with saying that he sent some letter, or he's giving this interview that he never met with Trump during the Trump presidency, to be able to reach out to Biden administration. Whereas it's a new era, new people, and the last thing the Biden wants to see, Biden government wants to see, someone in this relationship with baggage of the Trump and Trump relationship and Trump friendship. These people became prominent due to their ties to Trump family, and they're still clinging the power with this PR stance. But the Turkish businessmen are losing and cannot make any kind of business due to this interesting PR wars.
No, it's again, I would just emphasize that the Trump-Erdogan relationship became paramount in the formulation of Turkish US relations. It was a very personalized relationship. That has now changed. Now, of course, relations between Turkey and the United States are going to have the stamp of President Biden on them. But President Biden, as much as he puts his own personality into his foreign policy, is not going to conduct foreign policy the way President Trump did. It is not going to be personalized. It's not going to be all about the personal inclinations of one person. And we're seeing that manifest. And unfortunately, for many people in Turkey who are trying to improve relations between the United States and Turkey, there are a lot of people who simply, as you say, are clinging on to their old connections. Trust me, the last thing you want to do with the current White House, not so much with Joe Biden, but certainly with the people subordinate to him in the White House, and I would definitely include Miss Jen Psaki in that, is do not in any way identify yourself or any connection with the Trump administration. So, anything else? I think we're running out of time.
Yes, we ran out of the time. Actually, Ibrahim Kalın's interview, there is also this, we have covered this extensively in Ahval English. If you like to add a couple of sentences, what was he talked about S-400, he talked about how he's trying to reach out to Egypt and Arab world. If you'd like to say a couple of words on that, and then we can close it.
Real fast. I find it fascinating that Kalın kind of stepped over what Hulusi Akar had said. Hulusi Akar had earlier, I think a few days earlier, talked about a way forward, some sort of way that you wouldn't really deploy the S-400s. Obviously, he would do that because Hulusi Akar understands that the Turkish defense industry and the Turkish military need access to the military, the defense industry knowledge, if not the items themselves, but certainly some of the items of the United States. And with all these end user agreements, there's parts and components that will now not be able to go from the United States to Turkey. And by the way, it has now gone beyond the F-35. Congress has made it quite clear that due to Turkey's participation with Azerbaijan in the recent startup of Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, that they are suspending the transfer, really just about everything. I mean, it's almost kind of like an underneath the radar, to mix metaphors, an underneath the radar arms embargo against Turkey, a de facto arms embargo. And that's because everything has to go through Congress. And as we've talked about before, Turkey doesn't have any friends in the U.S. Congress. Nobody's willing to go to bat for Turkey at this point. It's a bad place to be. What was the other thing, Colin, on that? Oh, relations with the Arab world. This is always fascinating to me. For some reason, the kind of neo-Ottomans that surround President Erdogan and others, and not everybody in the AKP is a neo-Ottoman. Let's be clear about that. But many of them are, and they have this incredibly flawed and historically true narrative about the relationship between the Ottomans and the Arabs. The Arabs were subject people. And people make a lot of the fact that Great Britain and France had basically colonized the Middle East, but for how long? I mean, for how long were countries of the Middle East under the colonial rule of Great Britain or France? 50 to 100 years, depending on the country. For how long were Arab lands dominated and controlled by the Ottomans? Well, about 500.
Yeah.
Well, there's still a lot of resentment among Arabs against Turks. You can play it down and, nobody builds up resentments. But if you go around talking about a restoration of the glories of the Ottomans, that will not endear you at all to Arab nations. And the notion, Colin has this notion of somehow patching up things between Egypt and Turkey at this point in time. I don't see that happening. Next time we can talk about the growing cooperation between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. Oh, and by the way, throw Egypt into that because they're going to be joining along too.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was good. Little over time, but there was some breaking news. And thank you for the insightful remarks.
All right. Take care. And I'll see you again next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.